Want to be a homeowner? It's easy if you get out of Sydney or Melbourne. I get annoyed when people talk about the only house that you can buy apparently is in Sydney and it's too dear. There are other parts of Australia. I live in one, it's called Tamworth. These are the words of our Deputy Prime Minister, Barnaby Joyce, speaking to ABCRN Drive when questioned about the annual Demographia International Housing Affordability Survey. The survey made headlines yesterday after it claimed Sydney is the world's second least affordable housing market, second only to Hong Kong. Not surprisingly, Mr. Joyce's comments were quickly slammed as being completely out of touch with the vast majority of Sydneysiders, as ABC reported. And while that argument certainly has merit, what if the Nationals leader has a point too? When we talk about housing affordability, it really is confined to just Sydney and Melbourne. And these maps comparing house prices in 2011 and 2016 in Sydney and Melbourne versus Brisbane and Perth, released by CoreLogic, make a valid point about this two-speed Australian housing market and a compelling visual argument to shun the two cities and head north or west. News.com.au reported on the bleak map of Sydney house prices earlier in January when it was released by CoreLogic, which looked like a sea of red in December 2016, indicating just how many Sydney suburbs now have median house prices $1 million or above. But now Cameron Cusher, CoreLogic's head of research, has revealed the maps of Melbourne, Brisbane, and Perth. Like Sydney, house price growth in Melbourne has been noticeably strong, albeit to a lesser extent than Sydney. In December 2011, the red suburbs, where the median value is $1 million of above, were largely contained to those areas within 10 kilometers of the CBD, with only a handful of suburbs beyond 10 kilometers creeping into the red zone. Compare that to December 2016, and those suburbs within a 10 kilometers radius of the city centre are almost exclusively million-dollar suburbs, and about half of those within 20 kilometers have hit a median price of six figures. There are even a few more than 50 kilometers of the CBD, mainly along the Mornington Peninsula, that have turned red. Juxtapose this against Brisbane and Perth and you can see why Barnaby Joyce has a point. In Brisbane and Perth, the maps remain relatively unchanged over the 5-year period. And the red suburbs, the million-dollar suburbs, are the minority rather than the majority. In Perth, the number of six-figure suburbs has actually declined as the capital city adjusts to the mining downturn. Severely unaffordable. Both Sydney and Melbourne were labelled severely unaffordable by Demographia's 2017 Housing Affordability Survey. They both even made the list of the top 10 least affordable housing markets of the 406 metropolitan housing markets in 9 countries the survey analysed. Sydney came in at second with house prices more than 12 times the average income, and Melbourne came in at 10th with house prices almost 10 times the average income. Both cities were ranked above several other global cities associated with pricey real estate, including London, Los Angeles, and New York. The pressure is now heating up for newly appointed NSW Premier Gladys Berejiklian to fix housing affordability in the state, and fix it fast. Just a day before the Demographia report, Ms. Berejiklian vowed to make housing affordability one of her key priorities as Premier. She stopped short of endorsing any specific policies, but the new Premier reiterated her preference for increasing housing supply. But housing experts and other industry pundits have offered other ideas for reform. The Real Estate Institute for New South Wales, REINSW, is calling on the new Premier to review costly stamp duty and introduce better first homebuyer incentives. The NSW government has seen windfall after windfall in recent years, and it is time to give back. We urge Premier Barnaby to recognize that stamp duty has not been reviewed for 30 years, REINSW President John Cunningham said. Premier Barnaby can lead NSW into a future where incentives for first home buyers purchasing existing properties are reinstated. We call on Premier Barnaby, as leader of the NSW government, to reduce stamp duty for first home buyers by 50% for the purchase of a residential property less than $1 million. We also urge her to provide the ability to pay the stamp duty over time in what will help to ease the housing affordability crisis that we are experiencing. REINSW also propose a one-off 50% concession for the over 65s up to $1 million, another step that it says will help to get the supply chain moving. Grant Herod, the CEO of LJ Hooker, said another option includes investing in more affordable housing stock. The provision of affordable housing for these low and middle-income families is required to ensure a diverse range of households have access to housing across all areas of our capital cities. However, at present, it has not been feasible for developers to provide affordable solutions. The government, therefore, needs to step in with incentives to ensure the delivery of affordable housing can occur. After all, having nurses live near hospitals and teachers live near schools just makes sense. Easier said than done. But while Barnaby Joyce has a point that life exists outside of Sydney and Melbourne, packing up and moving interstate is undoubtedly easier said than done. There is a reason why we're migrating to, and not leaving, these two cities. Job opportunities being a major one. Job creation outside of Sydney and Melbourne, particularly over the last 5 or 6 years, has been extremely weak, so people don't necessarily have the confidence that if they move to another part of the country they'll be able to get a similar or better job, Mr. Cusher told news.com.au. On top of weak jobs growth, Bernard Salt, KPMG Australia demographer, told news.com.au that the diversity of jobs is often greater in Sydney and Melbourne than elsewhere in Australia, particularly in regional areas on the fringe of Sydney and Melbourne themselves, such as Mr. Joyce's Tamworth. And it's not something our generation can necessarily fix either. The issue is always one of jobs. Job diversity, job depth, job scale, relocation of jobs out of capital cities, Mr. Salt said. And to some extent you can relocate jobs with government departments. For example, the Transport Accident Commission relocated 700 jobs outside of Exhibition Street in Melbourne to Geelong in 2008. However, more broadly, the issue is one of that the scale of jobs and the types of jobs available in Melbourne or Sydney is not always replicable in a Ballarat or a Bendigo or a Bathurst. You can relocate if you are a school teacher or a doctor, but if you are in a very specialist type of job, such as finance or technology, often the openings for those jobs are not available in regional areas. So can anything be done? Possibly. For starters, Mr. Cusher said businesses can be more accommodating and flexible. Business can become more accepting of people working remotely. Or maybe people having to be in Sydney 2 or 3 days a week, but then living somewhere else the rest of the time when working from home, he said. However, the most important solution for Mr. Cusher is closer to home. The big one is investing in infrastructure investment within the states, he told news.com.au. They are talking about fast trains between Sydney and Melbourne, but if they actually improved the trains between Sydney and Newcastle, or Sydney and Bathurst or Wollongong in those kinds of areas, then you could make it a much more viable option to live in those areas where housing is much more affordable. For Mr. Salt, there needs to be a much more strategic approach to planning. I think that what should have happened in Sydney a generation ago is that it should have had a binary focus, where you have a substantial investment in a second CBD at Parramatta or Blacktown, so that you have job depth, scale and diversity in the West, which could then support cheap house and land packages across the Cumberland Plain, he told news.com.au. This is about strategic thinking 30 or 40 years into the future. And this is the problem for Sydney. Its strategic plan goes out to 2030. Sydney doesn't think far into the future. Julia.corduroy@news.com.au